Hi, Yeb.
Hi,
Thank you for
Phil.
joining us. Um, we've had a relatively small amount of global warming from pre-industrial times compared to what would occur in the future. Are we already seeing impacts from this warming?
Yes, this relatively small amount is at least 0.85 degrees from Celsius from pre-industrial times. That is by no means insignificant. And yes, I think we have entered an era where the impacts of climate change are already being felt very profoundly in many places around the world.
Um, what's the connection with more severe storms and climate change?
As the science is becoming much clearer into focus, and the scenario for climate change is that it will mean more intense tropical cyclones, and and that is the prognosis. As to whether we are already seeing that, I think it is safe to assume that all of the extreme events that we are already seeing around the world right now are on in steroids because of climate change.
When you received the news that Typhoon Haiyan had hit your home country, the Philippines, do you remember how you felt?
Certainly, that particular moment when we got news of even before we got news of the devastation that was left behind in the wake of the typhoon, we really felt very concerned. First of all, the communications lines had been cut off, and there was very little information that was trickling in, and we were very concerned about our loved ones and the fate of many people that were in the path of the typhoon.
Your speech at the time had a visibly emotional effect on the other delegates. Did that translate into action to stop climate change?
We'd like to believe that not just the statement that we delivered, but the backdrop of the strongest storm ever recorded that has made landfall in human history would have translated and resonated in a way that it would have influenced the outcome of Warsaw. And many people believe that the outcome on loss and damage was highly influenced by the backdrop of the super typhoon. I'd like to believe as well that what we have done as a matter of an act of conscience, not just the speech, but also the act of fasting, would have had an effect on the overall seriousness and willingness of countries to move the process forward.
Yes, the fasting has become quite commonplace in the news at the moment. People are talking about this issue. What, why did you decide to fast? Why fasting?
At that particular moment when I announced to the whole world that we would abstain from food during the Warsaw Conference, the primary thought that was in my mind was just to stand in solidarity with people who are obviously struggling to find food in the aftermath of the disaster, but also to sympathize with everyone else around the world who are being affected by climate change. And that is based also on my firm belief that fasting is a very powerful instrument to drive change in the world and to help us evolve into more caring societies.
Why do you think it? Why do you think it has that effect on people? What
Well,
is it about fasting?
anyone who goes fasting will have to have a higher level of selflessness, a higher level of being able to connect to the suffering in the world, and that makes you more reflective and cognizant of the kinds of change that we need to drive in the world.
And was there anything at the time that you saw that was positive around you when you at such a very low time? Did you see any acts of support which really made you quite hopeful?
Oh, definitely. In the days that followed the opening of the Warsaw COP, hundreds of delegates, in fact, joined us in the fasting, and in my many years in this process, uh, for the first time, I saw a certain level of seriousness among negotiators and among parties that were engaged in that process, an earnest, sincere effort to work together and come up with an outcome that can be meaningful.
So, is there anybody or any particular thing that's blocking action on climate change at the moment? Anything in your mind that is a real blocker?
This is a difficult process, and nothing is really black and white. What we see as a very uh, alarming development is when developed countries backtrack on their commitments, and when we think about uh, parties or quarters that block this process, it is those entities or even countries who walk away from their commitments and who, at a very bad with a very bad sense of timing, would announce something that would not build confidence and would in fact be detrimental to the process.
How does that make you feel? Because these countries historically are responsible for climate change because of they industrialized early on, and a lot of the climate change gases enter the atmosphere, and that's why we're receiving the warming that we are now. Do you feel resentful towards those countries when you see them blocking action?
I guess resentful is not the term that I would use. So what I would always take into account would be the context of unfairness. And when we talk about climate change, it's not merely greenhouse gas emissions. We're talking about decades of exploitation. We were talking about many years, even centuries of a perpetuation of a world order that destroys the planet, affects social well-being, and drives the gap between the rich and the poor much wider. So we're talking about a more complex set of problems here, and climate change is merely a symptom of all of this that result in a dysfunctional world.
Um, if warming is allowed to continue to 2 degrees of warming, or as much as 4 degrees, what kind of impacts are we likely to see, and which people are most likely to feel these impacts?
When we talk about the adverse impacts of climate change, those who are most vulnerable are those who have the least responsibility for this problem. And I'm also talking about communities in countries that happen to be most exposed and most sensitive to the threats that come along with climate change. And when we talk about a 4-degree scenario, we will see massive extinction of species, compromised water security, food supplies will will be compromised, and that even 2 degrees is what we can consider the point where a lot of irreversible changes take place. For a country like the Philippines and many other countries in the developing world, we will contend with stronger and more intense typhoons that would affect the way we pursue development, and of course massive large-scale shifts that we will see as climate change intensifies.
How should we be adapting? I know that we have talked about mitigation and stopping the worst effects, but in terms of adaptation, can we adapt?
The problem is not, it's not necessarily an easy situation, because the level of adaptation that is needed will just depend on the level of mitigation that will happen. And what we face right now is a situation where mitigation ambition is at its lowest, and we see very little direction in that context. For adaptation, what we need to do, first of all developing countries must, with careful thoughtfulness, allocate every single uh, dollar of their national budgets to building resilience. That is a minimum, and everything else that need to be done, we must secure the necessary resources from all over the world, especially from rich countries, so that the most vulnerable, can put in place measures. We're talking about preventing disruptions in the agricultural system. We're talking about protecting communities in low-lying areas, and enhancing the capability of natural ecosystems to protect itself, and be able to provide the ecosystem services for communities around the world. So it's not a simple undertaking. It's gonna be a very massive, comprehensive undertaking.
Just a few more questions. Yeah, just watching the volume here because sometimes it cuts out. But let's continue because I think we got everything. What scale of change is needed to avoid the warming, the 2 degrees warming? For example, changes in economics, social systems, energy, and lifestyles. Is it a matter of tinkering around the edges, or are the changes that we need more profound?
What we need to see in order to avert a catastrophic climate change and a future where we have dangerous climate change is massive, transformational social and economic change in the same scale as the first industrial revolution. So it's going to be massive. And we're not just talking about economics and industry, we're talking about mindsets and behaviors and individual lifestyles even. It is about also being able uh, uh, to transplant the current world order where we depend on fossil fuels. That must change in order for us to avert a serious crisis.
Very true. As part of the project that we're working on at Friends of the Earth at the moment, called Big Ideas Change the World, it's a project about well-being and actually trying to conceive how that shift would happen, both in terms of the psychological effects of change of behaviour, as well as the more macro issues of climate change. Empathy is something that some people say that we've lost touch with, and the further the distance that people are from something, the less empathetic they can really be. It's more sympathetic. How do you reach out to people, and are people important, or is it more important to reach out to governments?
Well, even the IPCC has said that human behavior is the least well understood component of the climate system, and we do need to work on that. I agree we need to continue reaching out to governments and speaking to governments, but the battle against climate change is a battle also of the hearts and minds, not just a battle, a legal battle, or a battle that will be won at the through diplomacy. And that's why I believe that even outside of the international process, there's a lot of things that we can do to affect transformational change in societies. This is a war that we are in, and a war that we cannot afford to lose. But a war I think we can win if we are able to affect that change and instill that there is hope for humanity.
Just one last question, yeah, if I may. Imagine 2050, you're standing in a city, any city really around the world. What would you like to see?
Well, that's a tough question because 2050 is not that far from today, and there are two possible scenarios. What I would like to see is a community that is resilient, that can sustain itself, that is not vulnerable to the vagaries of global economy, and is able to sustain life for its citizens. A city that where people are happy, and I think happiness is again something that we've lost touch with in this dog eat dog world, and that is what I would like to see. People simply happy in that future city that we envision.